September 17th, 1935, 6:43 a.m. A garbage collector named Marcus Williams turned onto 131st Street in Harlem, and his morning routine died right there. The body was slumped against a brick wall in an alley between two tenement buildings. No struggle, no mess. Just a man in an expensive suit with a single bullet hole behind his right ear, execution style. Marcus didn't scream. He'd seen death before. But something about this one felt different. Colder, more deliberate. He flagged down Officer Patrick O'Malley, who took one look and immediately called for backup. Within 20 minutes, the alley was swarming with cops, detectives, and curious neighbors leaning out of windows, whispering. The victim was identified quickly. Tommy, the Hammer, Malone, enforcer, collector, one of Dutch Schultz's most trusted men in Harlem. But it wasn't the body that made Detective Raymond Carter's blood run cold. It was the note. Pinned to Malone's chest with a straight razor was a single piece of paper. No fingerprints, no smudges, just 7 words written in perfect block letters. 7 days, 6 left. Leave Harlem now. Carter read it twice, then a third time. This wasn't a robbery, he muttered to O'Malley. This wasn't a turf dispute gone wrong. This was planned. O'Malley nodded slowly, scanning the crowd gathering at the alley's entrance. You think this is about last night? Last night? Carter asked. The Cotton Club. Words already spreading. Dutch Schultz got into it with someone. Bad. Real bad. Carter folded the note carefully and slipped it into an evidence bag. His hands weren't shaking, but his gut told him something most cops in New York would take weeks to figure out. This wasn't random. This was a message. And if the note was accurate, if someone was counting down, then 6 more men were going to die unless Dutch Schultz did exactly what he was told. The problem? Dutch Schultz didn't take orders from anyone, especially not in Harlem. Carter looked up at the rooftops, the fire escapes, the 100 windows staring down at him. Somewhere in this neighborhood, someone was watching, waiting, counting, and the clock had already started. To understand why Tommy Malone died that morning, you have to rewind 12 hours, back to the Cotton Club, back to the moment everything changed. But before we go there, if you're new here, hit that subscribe button. We're diving deep into true crime stories that'll keep you up at night. And trust me, you don't want to miss what happens next. Now, let's get into it. September 16th, 1935, Monday night, 142nd Street and Lenox Avenue. The Cotton Club wasn't just a nightclub, it was a contradiction wrapped in velvet curtains and jazz music. Over 200 people packed inside that night. The best black musicians in America performed on stage. The most talented black dancers moved like liquid across the floor. Black waiters served drinks. Black cooks prepared food in the back. But if you were black and wanted to sit down as a guest, the door stayed closed. The Cotton Club was owned by white gangsters, run by white managers, and reserved exclusively for white patrons who wanted to experience black culture without actually sitting next to black people. That's how it worked in 1935. That's how Dutch Schultz and his crew liked it. The air inside was thick with cigarette smoke, expensive perfume, and illegal whiskey. Prohibition had officially ended 2 years earlier, but old habits died hard, and the Cotton Club's liquor still came from Schultz's underground distilleries. The band was in full swing. Trumpets wailed. A singer's voice cut through the noise like silk over gravel. Laughter echoed from corner booths, where men in tailored suits made deals over drinks that cost more than most Harlem families earned in a week. Near the back, away from the spotlight and the noise, sat Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson, alone, quiet, observing. Most people didn't even notice him. That's how he preferred it. While everyone else performed, talked loud, laughed louder, made sure they were seen, Johnson watched, calculated, remembered. He wasn't there to party. He was there because business required presence, because power in Harlem meant showing up, even to places that didn't want you. His bourbon sat untouched on the table. His eyes moved slowly across the room, cataloging faces, noting conversations, reading the temperature of the night. Everything was routine, until Dutch Schultz stood up. Schultz had been drinking for hours. You could see it in the way he moved, loose, aggressive, looking for something to prove. His crew tried to settle him down, but Schultz waved them off. He had a target in mind. The room didn't notice at first. The music kept playing. Conversations continued. But a few people, the ones who understood power and violence, felt the shift. Schultz crossed the club slowly, deliberately, weaving between tables. His eyes locked on Johnson. And everyone who saw where he was headed held their breath. Because, in 1935 New York, when Dutch Schultz decided to make a point, people got hurt. When he reached Johnson's table, Schultz didn't sit down, didn't ask permission, didn't lower his voice. He slammed his hand down hard enough to rattle the glass, spilling Johnson's bourbon across the table. The band kept playing for another 3 seconds. Then the trumpet player missed a note. The drummer faltered. The singer's voice trailed off mid-lyric. And the Cotton Club, all 200 people inside, went silent, because everyone knew what was about to happen next would change everything. Dutch Schultz stood over Bumpy Johnson's table, swaying slightly, whiskey on his breath, rage in his eyes. The silence in the Cotton Club was suffocating. 200 people frozen. Waiters stopped mid-step. Dancers stood still on the floor. Even the bartender quit pouring drinks. Everyone watched. Schultz leaned forward, both hands planted on the table now, his face inches from Johnson's. "You got a lot of nerve," Schultz said, his voice cutting through the quiet like broken glass. "Sitting here, in my club, drinking my whiskey, acting like you belong." Johnson didn't move, didn't blink. His expression remained calm, almost bored. That only made Schultz angrier. "You think because you run a few numbers in Harlem, you're somebody?" Schultz's voice got louder. "You think, because these people," he gestured wildly at the room, "are scared of you. That means something to me." Still, Johnson said nothing. Schultz straightened up, addressing the entire club now, making sure his words carried to every corner. "Let me tell you something about how this city works, about how this whole damn operation works." He pointed at Johnson. "People like him? They exist because people like me allow it. We own the liquor, we own the clubs, we own the streets. And when we say jump, they ask how high." A few nervous laughs from Schultz's crew. Nobody else made a sound. Schultz turned back to Johnson, his voice dropping to something meaner, more personal. "You've been moving in on my policy operations, taking my runners, telling my collectors they work for you now." He leaned in again. "That stops tonight. You work for me, or you don't work at all. And if you've got a problem with that," he let the threat hang in the air. Then came the slur, loud, vicious, racist, the kind of word designed to strip away dignity, to remind everyone in the room exactly where Schultz believed Johnson belonged in the social order. He said it twice, made sure it echoed. Some of the white patrons looked uncomfortable. A few black waiters stared at the floor. But nobody moved. Nobody intervened. Because this was 1935. Because this was how power worked. Because Dutch Schultz could say whatever he wanted, to whomever he wanted, and the world would keep spinning. Quick question for you. Where are you watching this from right now? Drop your city or country in the comments. I'm curious how far these stories travel. Schultz wasn't finished. "You've got 2 choices, Bumpy." He said the name like it was a joke. "You either start paying me a cut of everything you make in Harlem, 50%, starting this week, or you pack up and disappear. Because if I see you running operations in my territory after tonight, I'll make sure you regret it." He straightened his jacket, smiled at his crew, played to the crowd. "Hell, maybe I'll just take over everything myself. Cut out the middleman. What do you think, boys? Think Harlem needs Bumpy Johnson? Or can we handle things just fine without him?" Laughter from his table. Forced, uncomfortable laughter from a few others trying to stay on Schultz's good side. Johnson finally moved. Slowly, he reached for a napkin and wiped the spilled bourbon off the table, folded the napkin neatly, set it down. Then he looked up at Schultz. His voice was quiet, calm, the kind of calm that makes smart people nervous. "You've got 7 days to get every one of your people out of Harlem. After that, any white man I find running policy in my neighborhood dies." The room somehow got quieter. Schultz blinked, processed what he'd just heard. Then he laughed loud, exaggerated, performative. "Is that a threat?" He looked around the club, making sure everyone heard. "Did this man just threaten me? In my own club? Johnson stood up slowly. He wasn't tall, but he carried himself like he was. He buttoned his jacket, adjusted his cuffs, and met Schultz's eyes without flinching. It's not a threat, Johnson said. It's a schedule. Schultz's smile faltered for just a second. Then he recovered, stepping closer, trying to intimidate through proximity. You're a dead man, Bumpy. You just don't know it yet. By this time next week, you'll either be working for me or buried somewhere nobody'll ever find you. Johnson didn't respond. He simply walked past Schultz, past his crew, past the silent crowd, and headed for the door. Nobody stopped him. Nobody said a word. Schultz watched him leave, then turned back to the room, arms spread wide. Show's over, folks. Let's get this music back on. The band started playing again. Conversations resumed. Drinks were poured. Dutch Schultz went back to his table, convinced he'd won. He had no idea what he'd just started. Bumpy Johnson stepped out of the Cotton Club into the cool September night. The door closed behind him, muffling the music and laughter inside. The street was quiet. A few cars parked along the curb, streetlights casting long shadows across the pavement. He didn't rush, didn't look over his shoulder, didn't show even a flicker of the rage that most men would have felt after being publicly humiliated. He simply walked, 3 blocks south, then east toward his apartment. His footsteps steady, measured, deliberate. Inside the Cotton Club, Dutch Schultz was celebrating. He ordered another round for his table, slapped his men on the back, told the story again, louder this time, about how he'd just put Bumpy Johnson in his place. Did you see his face? Schultz laughed, whiskey sloshing in his glass. Thought he could threaten me. Me. In my own club. His crew laughed along. They had to. But a few of them, the smarter ones, the ones who'd been in the game long enough to recognize danger, weren't laughing as hard. One of them, a man named Vincent Cole's cousin, leaned in close. Boss, maybe we should take that seriously. Johnson doesn't make empty threats. Schultz waved him off. Johnson's a nobody. He runs numbers for black folks in Harlem. That's it. He's got no muscle, no connections, no real power. What's he gonna do? Send a strongly worded letter? More laughter. More drinks. But the truth Schultz was too drunk and too arrogant to see, was that Bumpy Johnson had just declared war. Not the loud kind. Not the kind with shootouts in the street and headlines in the papers. The quiet kind. The kind that ended with bodies and silence. By the time Schultz stumbled out of the Cotton Club at 2 a.m., Johnson was already 3 steps ahead. He'd made 4 phone calls from a payphone on 135th Street. Short conversations, no names, just instructions. He'd visited 2 apartments, knocked on 2 doors, had 2 brief conversations with 2 men who owed him favors. By 3 a.m., the plan was in motion. Schultz went to bed that night in his penthouse on the Upper West Side, convinced he'd won. Convinced Johnson would either fall in line or disappear. He slept soundly. Johnson didn't sleep at all. He sat in a small room above a barbershop on Lenox Avenue, a single lamp burning, a notebook open in front of him. 7 names written in neat handwriting. 7 men who worked for Dutch Schultz. 7 men who collected money, intimidated shop owners, and enforced Schultz's will in Harlem. 7 men who would serve as a message. Johnson wasn't angry. Anger made you sloppy. Anger made you emotional. Anger got you killed. He was calm, focused, methodical. Schultz had made this personal, had turned a business dispute into a public humiliation, had used racial slurs in front of 200 people to remind Johnson and everyone watching that he believed white gangsters were superior. That was the mistake, because Schultz didn't understand Harlem, didn't understand that the people he saw as inferior were the same people who knew every alley, every rooftop, every hiding spot in the neighborhood, didn't understand that loyalty in Harlem wasn't bought with money, it was earned through respect. And Schultz had just disrespected the one man Harlem trusted most. Johnson closed the notebook, folded it carefully, slipped it into his jacket pocket. He stood, turned off the lamp, and walked to the window. Outside, Harlem was sleeping, but soon it would wake up to something it hadn't seen in years. A reckoning. Schultz had given Johnson an ultimatum: work for him or die. Johnson had given Schultz a deadline, 7 days. One of them had underestimated the other, and by sunrise, the first body would prove which one had made the fatal mistake. The clock was ticking, and Dutch Schultz had no idea how little time he had left. Before we go any further, before the bodies start dropping and the countdown begins, you need to understand who these men really were. Because this wasn't just a fight between two gangsters. This was a collision between two completely different philosophies of power. And if you're enjoying this story so far, do me a favor, smash that like button and drop a comment letting me know what you think. It helps more people discover these stories. All right, let's talk about the players. Dutch Schultz, the Dutchman, born Arthur Simon Flegenheimer in the Bronx, 1901. Poor Jewish kid who grew up watching his father abandon the family, leaving his mother to raise him and his sister alone. By age 14, he was running with street gangs. By 17, he'd done his first stint in prison for burglary. When he got out, he decided Arthur Flegenheimer wasn't a name that commanded respect, so he became Dutch Schultz, a name that sounded tougher, more intimidating, more American, and it worked. By 1935, Dutch Schultz controlled illegal beer distribution across the Bronx and Manhattan. He ran speakeasies during Prohibition. He operated the numbers racket illegal lottery games that pulled in millions of dollars a year from working-class neighborhoods. He was violent, unpredictable, known for beating men with his bare hands when they crossed him, but he was also smart. He hired the best accountants, kept meticulous records, and knew how to avoid taxes better than almost anyone in the business. The federal government tried to nail him for tax evasion, the same charge that took down Al Capone. Schultz beat the case. Twice. He was untouchable, or so he thought. Schultz believed power came from three things: money, violence, and fear. If you had more money than your enemies, you could buy better guns. If you had better guns, you could create more fear. And if people feared you, they obeyed you. Simple, brutal, effective. By 1934, Schultz had expanded into Harlem, taking over the numbers racket from smaller operators. He installed his own collectors, his own enforcers, his own system, and for a while, it worked, until he met Bumpy Johnson, Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson, the gentleman gangster. Born in Charleston, South Carolina, 1905, moved to Harlem as a teenager to escape the violence and racism of the Jim Crow South. He got his nickname Bumpy from a bump on the back of his head, a deformity he'd had since childhood. Kids teased him about it. Adults underestimated him because of it. Big mistake. Johnson was smart. Not street smart, though he had that too, but genuinely intelligent. He read constantly, studied history, philosophy, strategy. He could quote Shakespeare and Marcus Garvey in the same conversation. But don't let the gentleman part fool you. Johnson was also one of the most dangerous men in Harlem. He'd killed his first man at 19. Spent time in Sing Sing prison for armed robbery. Learned the game from Stephanie Street, Claire, the legendary Queen of Numbers, who ran Harlem's policy operations before Schultz tried to take over. Where Schultz relied on fear and violence, Johnson relied on something deeper: loyalty. He didn't just take from Harlem, he gave back. Paid for funerals when families couldn't afford them. Made sure kids had food during the Depression. Protected shop owners from outside gangs trying to muscle in. People in Harlem didn't just fear Bumpy Johnson. They respected him, trusted him, protected him. That was his power. And it was a kind of power Dutch Schultz would never understand. Schultz saw Harlem as territory to exploit. Johnson saw it as home to protect. Schultz saw black people as inferior, as obstacles, as tools to be used and discarded. Johnson saw them as his community, his people, his responsibility. When Schultz started moving into Harlem in 1934, Johnson initially tried to negotiate, offered to work together, suggested they split the territory fairly. Schultz refused. He wanted everything, and he made it clear that he believed Johnson and every other black operator in Harlem existed only because white gangsters allowed it. For months, Johnson watched, waited, let Schultz think he was winning, but he was planning, building alliances, mapping out Schultz's operations, identifying weaknesses. And then came September 16th, 1935. The Cotton Club, the insult, the humiliation. Schultz thought he was asserting dominance, thought he was putting Johnson in his place. What he actually did was give Johnson the justification he needed. Because up until that moment, This was just business. A turf war. The kind of thing that could be negotiated, compromised, settled. But when Schultz made it personal, when he used racial slurs in front of 200 people, when he publicly disrespected Johnson in a way designed to humiliate not just him, but every black person in that room, he crossed a line. He turned a business dispute into a matter of honor. And honor, in Bumpy Johnson's world, was worth dying for, or killing for. So now you understand. Dutch Schultz, wealthy, connected, violent, convinced of his own superiority. Bumpy Johnson, strategic, patient, respected, and deeply underestimated. One man believed power came from money and guns. The other knew power came from loyalty and silence. One man thought Harlem was a place to conquer. The other knew Harlem was a fortress that protected its own. When these two men collided, only one of them understood what was really at stake, and only one of them would walk away. The question wasn't who was tougher. The question was who understood the game better. By 6:43 a.m. on September 17th, the answer started becoming clear, because while Dutch Schultz slept soundly in his penthouse, confident he'd won, Bumpy Johnson's plan was already in motion, and the first body was about to be discovered. Day 1, September 17th, 1935. Tommy the Hammer Malone was found at 6:43 a.m., slumped in an alley on 131st Street. Single bullet, back of the head, execution style. The note pinned to his chest. 7 days, 6 left. Leave Harlem now. By 8 a.m., word had reached Dutch Schultz. He was eating breakfast in his penthouse when one of his lieutenants, a man named Mickey Rosenberg, burst through the door, out of breath, pale. "Boss, we got a problem." Schultz looked up from his eggs, annoyed. "What kind of problem?" "Tommy's dead. Found him in Harlem this morning. Shot. And there was a note." Schultz set down his fork slowly. "What kind of note?" Mickey handed him a copy the police had made. Schultz read it once, then again. For a moment, he said nothing. Then he crumpled the paper and threw it across the room. "Johnson," he muttered. "That son of a—" "You think it's him?" Mickey asked. "Of course it's him. Who else would be stupid enough to threaten me?" Schultz stood up, pacing now. "He thinks he can scare me with one dead body? Tommy probably got drunk and picked a fight with the wrong guy. This note's just Johnson trying to take credit." Mickey didn't look convinced. "Boss, the note says 6 more. What if nothing?" Schultz snapped. "Double the security on our collectors. Tell everyone to travel in pairs. And find Johnson. I want him brought to me, alive." Mickey nodded and left. Schultz poured himself a drink, even though it wasn't even 9 a.m. yet. He told himself this was nothing. A bluff. A desperate move by a desperate man. But deep down, in a place he wouldn't admit to anyone, he felt something unfamiliar. Doubt. Day 2, September 18th, 1935. The second body was discovered at 7:15 a.m. Leo, the Lip Castellano, another one of Schultz's enforcers, found in an abandoned warehouse on 125th Street. Same method, same precision, same type of note. 7 days, 5 left. Tick-tock. This time, Schultz couldn't dismiss it. He called an emergency meeting at a restaurant he owned in Midtown. 8 of his top men showed up, all of them nervous, all of them looking over their shoulders. "All right," Schultz said, slamming his hand on the table. 2 bodies in 2 days. Somebody talk. Who's seen Johnson? Who knows where he's hiding? Silence. One of his men, a collector named Paulie, finally spoke up. "Boss, we've been asking around. Nobody's talking. We go into Harlem, ask questions, and people act like they don't hear us. Shop owners, bartenders, even the guys who usually give us information, they're all silent." "So pay them more," Schultz said. "We tried. They won't take the money." Schultz stared at him. "What do you mean they won't take the money?" "I mean exactly that. We offer cash. They refuse. We threaten them. They still don't talk. It's like the whole neighborhood's protecting him." Schultz felt his jaw tighten. This wasn't how things worked. Money and fear always worked. Always. "Then we go harder," Schultz said. "I want every one of our guys armed. I want patrols in Harlem around the clock. And I want Johnson found. I don't care what it takes." But even as he said it, He knew something was wrong, because his men were scared. He could see it in their eyes. They weren't just worried about Johnson. They were worried about being next. Day 3, September 19th, 1935. The third body appeared at dawn. Frankie Numbers DeLuca, found on the steps of a church on 138th Street. Same execution, same note, 7 days, 4 left. Your move, Dutch. This one was different, though. Because Frankie hadn't just been killed, he'd been positioned, laid out carefully on the church steps like an offering, his hands folded across his chest, his eyes closed. It was theatrical, deliberate, a message within a message, and it terrified Schultz's crew. By noon, 3 of his collectors had quit, just walked away, said they weren't dying for a numbers racket in Harlem. Schultz tried to stop them, threatened them, but they didn't care. Fear of Bumpy Johnson had become greater than fear of Dutch Schultz. That afternoon, Schultz did something he rarely did. He went to the police. Not officially, he couldn't risk that. But he had cops on his payroll, detectives who looked the other way in exchange for cash. He met one of them, Detective Raymond Carter, in a back room of a bar on the west side. "I need you to find Johnson," Schultz said. "I need him arrested. I don't care what you charge him with. Just get him off the streets." Carter shook his head slowly. "Can't do it, Dutch." "What do you mean you can't do it? I pay you good money." "I mean we can't find him," Carter interrupted. "We've been looking. Every cop in Harlem's been looking. He's a ghost. Nobody's seen him. Nobody knows where he is. And even if we did find him, we got no evidence. No witnesses. Nothing. 3 of my men are dead. And nobody saw anything. Nobody heard anything. Every killing's been clean. Professional. Whoever's doing this knows what they're doing." Schultz leaned back, his mind racing. "Hey, quick question. What time is it where you are right now? Drop it in the comments. I'm curious when people are watching these stories," Carter continued. "My advice? Pull your guys out of Harlem, at least until this blows over." "Pull out?" Schultz's voice rose. "You think I'm going to let some 2-bit gangster chase me out of my own territory?" "I think," Carter said carefully, "that you've got 4 more days before 4 more bodies show up. And if you don't take this seriously, one of those bodies might be yours." Schultz stood up, furious, and stormed out. But Carter's words stayed with him, because for the first time in his life, Dutch Schultz wasn't in control. He couldn't find his enemy, couldn't stop the killings, couldn't even get information. And every morning, like clockwork, another one of his men turned up dead. 3 days, 3 bodies, 3 notes. And Bumpy Johnson was still nowhere to be found. Schultz went back to his penthouse that night and did something he hadn't done in years. He locked the door, drew the curtains, and sat in the dark with a loaded gun in his lap, waiting, wondering, counting down. 4 days left. Day 4, September 20th, 1935. Anthony "Tony Knuckles" Marino didn't show up for work. His wife called Schultz's office at 9 a.m., hysterical. Said Tony had left the house at 6 a.m. like he always did. Said he was supposed to check in by 8. Said she had a bad feeling. By 10 a.m., they found him, floating face down in the Harlem River near the 145th Street Bridge. Same bullet wound, same precision. The note was in a waterproof pouch tied to his wrist. 7 days. 3 left. Running out of time. Schultz's organization was unraveling. 2 more collectors quit that morning. One of his bookkeepers disappeared, just packed up and left town without a word. His drivers started refusing to go into Harlem, even in broad daylight. The fear was spreading like a disease, and Schultz could feel his grip slipping. He called another meeting. Only 5 men showed up. The rest sent excuses, claimed they were sick, had family emergencies, couldn't make it. Everyone knew the truth. They were terrified. "All right," Schultz said, his voice tight with barely controlled rage. "Here's what we're going to do. We're putting a bounty on Johnson. $10,000 to anyone who brings him to me, dead or alive." One of his men, a veteran enforcer named Sal, spoke up. "Boss, with all due respect, that's not going to work." "Why the hell not?" "Because nobody in Harlem's going to turn him in. You could offer 100,000 and they still wouldn't talk. They're protecting him." "Then we make an example," Schultz said. "We grab someone close to him, family, friends. We make them talk." Sal shook his head. "We tried. We can't find anyone. It's like he doesn't exist. No family in Harlem. No known address. No regular spots. He's a ghost. Schultz slammed his fist on the table. He's not a ghost. He's one man. One man can't take down my entire operation. But even as he said it, he knew it wasn't true. Because it wasn't just one man. It was Harlem. Every shop owner who refused to talk. Every witness who claimed they saw nothing. Every informant who suddenly went silent. Johnson had turned an entire neighborhood into his army, and Schultz was fighting blind. If you're still watching, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. This story's about to get even crazier, and you don't want to miss what happens next. Day 5. September 21st, 1935. Vincent Vinny the Rat Costello was found in an alley behind a speakeasy on Lenox Avenue. He'd been careful, traveled with 2 bodyguards, stayed in crowded areas, never went anywhere alone. Didn't matter. Someone got to him anyway. The bodyguards were found unconscious, knocked out, not killed. A message in itself. This wasn't about random violence. This was surgical, targeted. The note on Vinny's body was shorter this time. 2 left. That was it. No threats, no countdowns, just a simple statement of fact. 2 men left on Johnson's list. Schultz knew he was losing. His crew knew it too. That afternoon, one of his most trusted lieutenants, a man who'd been with him for 8 years, came to his office and quit. "I'm sorry, boss," the man said, not meeting Schultz's eyes. "I got a family. I can't do this anymore." Schultz didn't even try to stop him. He sat alone in his office for hours after that, staring at a map of Harlem spread across his desk. All those streets, all those buildings, all that territory he'd fought to control, and now it felt like a trap. He'd built his empire on the idea that power came from fear, that if you were ruthless enough, violent enough, people would fall in line. But Johnson had flipped the script. Now Schultz's own men were the ones who were afraid, and no amount of money or threats could change that. For the first time in his criminal career, Dutch Schultz considered retreat, not because he was weak, not because he couldn't fight, but because he was fighting an enemy he couldn't see, in a neighborhood that had turned against him, with men who no longer trusted him to keep them alive. Day 6, September 22nd, 1935. The 6th body was discovered at sunrise. Patrick "Paddy" O'Brien, Irish enforcer, one of Schultz's most brutal collectors, found in an empty lot on 132nd Street, a single bullet behind the ear. The note was pinned to a wooden post next to the body, visible from the street. "One left, last chance." By noon, Schultz's Harlem operation had completely collapsed. Every collector had either quit or gone into hiding. The policy banks, the locations where bets were taken and money was counted, sat empty. The runners who used to work the streets had vanished. 18 months of work, millions of dollars invested, all of it gone in 6 days. Schultz sat in his penthouse, surrounded by the few men who'd stayed loyal, and faced the reality he'd been avoiding. He'd lost. Not in a shootout, not in a dramatic confrontation. He'd lost because Bumpy Johnson understood something Schultz never had. In Harlem, respect mattered more than fear. One of his remaining men, Mickey Rosenberg, finally said what everyone was thinking. "Boss, we gotta pull out. We pull everyone out of Harlem today. Maybe this stops. Maybe Johnson's satisfied." Schultz wanted to argue, wanted to fight, wanted to prove he wasn't the kind of man who backed down. But he looked around the room at the handful of men left, men who were only still there out of loyalty or stupidity, and he knew Mickey was right. "Fine," Schultz said, the word tasting like poison. "Pull everyone out. Every collector, every runner, every operation. We're done in Harlem." Mickey nodded, relief visible on his face. "What about the last guy on the list?" The note said one left. Schultz's jaw tightened. "Tell him to get out of New York. Tonight. I don't care where he goes. Just get him out." Day 7, September 23rd, 1935. The last man on Johnson's list was named Robert "Bobby Knuckles" Sullivan. He'd already packed his bags, already bought a train ticket to Chicago, already said goodbye to his family. He was supposed to leave at 6 p.m. He was found at 5:47 p.m. in the train station bathroom, slumped against the wall. Same execution. Same precision. The note was in his jacket pocket. 7 days, 7 men. Harlem is ours again. When Schultz heard the news, he didn't rage, didn't threaten, didn't make promises about revenge. He just sat in silence, staring out the window of his penthouse at the city below. Johnson had done exactly what he said he would do. 7 days, 7 men, 7 executions carried out with military precision, while Schultz, one of the most powerful gangsters in New York, couldn't do a damn thing to stop it. The message was clear. Harlem wasn't Schultz's territory. It never had been. And anyone who forgot that would pay the price. What's the weather like where you are today? Sunny? Rainy? Let me know in the comments. That night, Schultz made a decision. He wouldn't just pull out of Harlem. He'd stay out, permanently. Because going back would mean admitting he'd been beaten, and staying would mean risking his life against an enemy who'd proven he could strike anywhere, anytime, without being caught. Dutch Schultz had built an empire on violence and intimidation. Bumpy Johnson had dismantled it with patience and precision, and the entire New York underworld was watching. 7 days that changed everything. 7 bodies that sent a message no gangster would ever forget. Harlem had spoken, and Dutch Schultz had finally learned to listen. September 24th, 1935. The 8th day. Dutch Schultz had pulled every single one of his operations out of Harlem. His collectors were gone. His runners had disappeared. His policy banks were shut down. He'd done exactly what Bumpy Johnson demanded. So, when the 8th body was discovered that morning, it sent shockwaves through New York's underworld. Because this one was different. The body was found at 7:30 a.m. on the corner of 135th and Lenox Avenue, right in the heart of Harlem, in broad daylight, where everyone could see it. His name was James, Jimmy the Fixer, Doyle. He wasn't on anyone's list, wasn't one of the original 7. In fact, he'd been trying to leave New York for days. But Jimmy had made a mistake. On the night of September 23rd, after Schultz had officially pulled out, Jimmy had gone back into Harlem, just for an hour, just to collect one last debt from a shop owner who owed him money. He thought it would be quick, thought nobody would notice. He was wrong. The note pinned to his chest was longer than the others. 8 days, 8 men. This is what happens when you don't listen. Harlem remembers. Harlem doesn't forgive. Stay out. When word reached Schultz, he went pale. Because the message was clear. Johnson wasn't just enforcing a deadline. He was enforcing a principle. It didn't matter that Schultz had pulled out. It didn't matter that he'd followed orders. One of his men had violated the terms, and Johnson had made an example of him. The 8th body wasn't about the original 7-day countdown. It was about the future. It was a warning to anyone Schultz's crew or any other white gangster in New York that Harlem was off limits. Permanently, Schultz called an emergency meeting with his remaining leadership. "This is insane," one of them said. "We pulled out. We did what he wanted. Why is he still killing our guys?" "Because Jimmy went back," Schultz said quietly. "He went back, and Johnson made sure everyone knows what happens when you do." The room went silent. "So what do we do?" Mickey asked. Schultz looked around at the faces staring back at him, men who'd once feared him, respected him, followed him without question. Now they just looked tired, beaten. "We stay out," Schultz said. "We don't go back. We don't send anyone back. We don't even talk about going back. Harlem belongs to Johnson now." It was the first time in Dutch Schultz's career that he'd publicly admitted defeat, and everyone in that room knew it. The 8th body did something the first 7 hadn't. It made Schultz's defeat absolute, because it proved that Johnson wasn't just defending territory, he was establishing a new order. The rules had changed. And everyone in New York's criminal underworld understood what that meant. You could fight over the Bronx. You could battle for Brooklyn. You could negotiate over Manhattan. But Harlem? Harlem was untouchable, not because Johnson had more guns or more money, but because he had something more powerful. The loyalty of an entire neighborhood and the willingness to enforce boundaries without hesitation. The cost to Schultz was staggering. 18 months of work gone. Millions of dollars in lost revenue gone. His reputation as an untouchable gangster shattered. 8 men dead, and he hadn't been able to stop a single killing. Worse than the financial loss was the psychological damage. Every gangster in New York now knew that Dutch Schultz, the man who'd beaten federal tax charges, The man who'd built an empire on fear had been outmaneuvered by a black gangster operating out of Harlem. Some saw it as a fluke, a lucky streak. But the smart ones, the ones who understood power, saw it for what it really was. A masterclass in strategy. Johnson had turned Schultz's greatest strength, his willingness to use violence, into his greatest weakness. Because while Schultz was loud, aggressive, and visible, Johnson was silent, patient, and invisible. And in a war between noise and silence had won. The eighth body was the final punctuation mark on a message that would echo through New York's underworld for decades. Cross Bumpy Johnson, and you'd pay. Disrespect Harlem, and you'd die. It was that simple. And Dutch Schultz would spend the rest of his life making sure he never forgot it. September 27th, 1935. 3 days after the eighth body, Bumpy Johnson walked into the Cotton Club. Same club where this had all started. Same tables, same music, same atmosphere. But everything had changed. When Johnson entered, conversations stopped. Heads turned. Eyes followed him as he made his way through the crowd. He wasn't hiding anymore. Wasn't in the shadows. Wasn't running. He walked calmly to a table near the back, the same table where Dutch Schultz had confronted him 11 days earlier, and sat down. A waiter appeared immediately, nervous, respectful. "What can I get you, Mr. Johnson?" "Bourbon. Neat." The waiter nodded and disappeared. Johnson sat alone, just like before. But this time, nobody approached him. Nobody challenged him. Nobody even looked at him the wrong way. Because everyone in that club, every gangster, every businessman, every patron knew exactly what he'd done. In 11 days, Bumpy Johnson had dismantled Dutch Schultz's Harlem operation, killed 8 men, and sent one of New York's most powerful gangsters running. And he'd done it without ever being seen. No arrests, no witnesses, no evidence. Just bodies and notes. Word spread fast. Within a week, every major crime figure in New York knew the story. Within a month, it had reached Chicago, Philadelphia, Boston. The legend of the 7-Day War became the kind of story gangsters told each other in quiet rooms, over drinks, when they wanted to make a point about strategy and respect. Some details got exaggerated, some got changed, but the core message remained the same. Don't disrespect Bumpy Johnson, and don't mess with Harlem. Dutch Schultz never returned to Harlem, not once. He continued running operations in the Bronx and other parts of Manhattan, but Harlem became a forbidden zone for his organization. His men knew better than to even suggest going back. The humiliation ate at him. Friends said he became more paranoid, more violent, more unpredictable. He started seeing enemies everywhere, started trusting fewer people, started making mistakes. On October 23rd, 1935, just 1 month after the Cotton Club confrontation, Dutch Schultz was shot in a restaurant in Newark, New Jersey. He died the next day. The official story was that the hit was ordered by the Commission, the governing body of organized crime, because Schultz had wanted to kill a federal prosecutor and they feared the backlash. But some people whispered a different theory. They said Schultz had become a liability after Harlem, that his defeat had made him look weak, that weakness in the underworld was a death sentence. Whether Johnson had anything to do with Schultz's death remains a mystery, but the timing was hard to ignore. Bumpy Johnson, meanwhile, became a legend. He took over the policy operations in Harlem completely. No competition, no interference, no white gangsters trying to muscle in. For the next 30 years, Johnson ran Harlem with an iron fist wrapped in a velvet glove. He was ruthless when he needed to be. But he was also respected, loved even. He paid for kids to go to college, funded local businesses, made sure families had food during hard times. He became more than a gangster. He became a protector, a symbol, and the story of the 7-Day War became his calling card. Whenever someone new tried to move into Harlem, whether they were Italian, Irish, Jewish, or anyone else, the old-timers would tell them the story. About the Cotton Club, about the insult, about the countdown, about what happened when you disrespected the wrong man. Most took the hint and stayed away. The few who didn't, they learned the hard way. The racial dynamics of the story weren't lost on anyone. In 1935 America, black people were expected to accept disrespect, expected to bow down, expected to know their place. Bumpy Johnson had refused. And not only had he refused, he'd won. In a country where black men were lynched for far less, where segregation was the law, where racism was woven into every institution, Johnson had stood up to a powerful white gangster and made him back down. That meant something. It meant something to the people of Harlem, who'd watched white gangsters profit off their community for years. It meant something to black gangsters across the country who'd been told they could only operate with white permission. It meant something to anyone who'd ever been told they were inferior and decided to prove otherwise. The 7-Day War wasn't just about territory or money. It was about respect, dignity, power, and the message it sent echoed far beyond the criminal underworld. Decades later, people still talked about it. Malcolm X mentioned Bumpy Johnson in his autobiography, calling him a legend in Harlem. Frank Lucas, another famous Harlem gangster, claimed Johnson was his mentor and told stories about his strategic brilliance. Movies, books, and TV shows reference the legend of Bumpy Johnson, the man who couldn't be intimidated, couldn't be bought, and couldn't be beaten. And at the center of all those stories was the same tale: the Cotton Club, the insult, the 7-day countdown, 8 bodies, 0 arrests, total victory. When reporters asked Johnson about it years later, about the killings, about Schultz, about how he'd pulled it off, he gave the same answer every time: simple, direct, unforgettable. Harlem protects its own. Choices have consequences. That was it. No elaboration, no details, no confessions, just a statement of fact. And everyone who heard it understood exactly what he meant. Dutch Schultz had made a choice that night in the Cotton Club. He'd chosen to humiliate Bumpy Johnson publicly, chosen to use racial slurs, chosen to treat Harlem like conquered territory, and he'd paid the price. 8 of his men dead, his operation destroyed, his reputation shattered. All because he'd underestimated the quiet man sitting alone in the back of the club. All because he'd forgotten that respect isn't given, it's earned, and disrespect isn't forgotten, it's avenged. So, what do we learn from this? What does a story from 1935 about gangsters, territory, and a 7-day countdown teach us nearly 90 years later? Everything. First, understand this: power isn't always loud. Dutch Schultz believed power came from making noise, from public displays of dominance, from making sure everyone knew he was in charge. Bumpy Johnson knew better. Real power is quiet, strategic, patient. While Schultz was celebrating his victory at the Cotton Club, Johnson was already 3 moves ahead. While Schultz was bragging to his crew, Johnson was planning 8 executions with surgical precision. Loud power gets attention. Quiet power gets results. Second, respect matters more than fear. Schultz ruled through intimidation. People obeyed him because they were scared of what he'd do if they didn't. Johnson ruled through loyalty. People protected him because he'd protected them first. When the war started, Schultz couldn't get information, couldn't find witnesses, couldn't get anyone in Harlem to help him, because fear only works until someone scarier comes along. But respect, loyalty, that lasts. Third, never underestimate someone because of who they are or where they come from. Schultz looked at Johnson and saw someone inferior, saw a black gangster operating in a black neighborhood, and assumed that meant he was less dangerous, less intelligent, less capable. That assumption cost him everything. The moment you underestimate someone based on race, background, or appearance, you've already lost. Because while you're busy feeling superior, they're busy planning your downfall. Fourth, know your environment. Schultz was fighting in Harlem, but he didn't understand Harlem. He saw it as territory to control. Johnson saw it as home to protect. That difference, that fundamental misunderstanding of the battlefield, decided the war before it even started. You can have all the money and guns in the world, but if you don't understand the ground you're fighting on, you'll lose. And finally, choices have consequences. Schultz made a choice that night in the Cotton Club. He could have handled the situation privately, could have negotiated, could have shown respect, even while asserting dominance. Instead, he chose humiliation, chose to make it personal, chose to turn a business dispute into a matter of honor. And that choice, that single decision, to disrespect Bumpy Johnson in front of 200 people, cost 8 men their lives and destroyed an empire worth millions. Every action creates a reaction. Every insult demands a response. Every choice leads somewhere. Schultz chose poorly, and he spent the last month of his life regretting it. Before you go, if this story kept you hooked, do me a huge favor. Hit that subscribe button, smash the like, and drop a comment letting me know what you thought. Should I cover more stories like this? Let me know. Your support keeps these stories coming. The 7-Day War ended nearly 90 years ago, but the lessons remain. Respect isn't optional, it's essential. Power isn't about volume, it's about strategy. And underestimating someone because of who they are is the fastest way to lose everything. Bumpy Johnson understood that. Dutch Schultz learned it too late. The Cotton Club still stands in Harlem today, rebuilt, reimagined, but still there. And if you walk past it on a quiet night, some people say you can still feel the weight of that September evening in 1935. The night one man made a threat, and another man kept a promise. 7 days, 8 bodies, one message. Harlem protects its own. Choices have consequences. Remember that.